My son handed me eviction papers the day after his inheritance cleared. I'm Frank Miller, 62 years old, and I raised an ungrateful Harvard MBA. Rick thought that $55 million made him untouchable. Thought his fancy degree gave him the right to call me an embarrassing blue-collar relic who was dragging down his image. He had big plans for our family home, turning it into something worthy of his new social circle. What Rick didn't know was that he'd only seen Will number one. See, there's something about Harvard Business School that they don't teach you. They don't teach you to respect the hands that built everything you're standing on. They don't teach you that wisdom doesn't always come with a diploma. And they definitely don't teach you to check your facts before you burn your bridges. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. Because Rick was about to learn that some lessons can only be taught the hard way. Let me paint you a picture of how my own son treated me in those final weeks. Rick had moved back into our family home after his mother passed. Said he needed time to process and figure out his next steps. What he really needed was time to plan my humiliation. It started small. He'd correct my grammar at dinner. It's, "I couldn't care less, Dad," not "I could care less." Always with that smirk, always followed by, "maybe if you'd gone to college." Then came the text messages to his friends. I saw them on his phone when he left it charging in the kitchen. "Stuck living with my dad for a few more weeks. Guy's a walking embarrassment. Can't wait to upgrade the family situation. Upgrade the family situation." That's what 34 years of raising him had become. The real humiliation started when his Harvard friends came over. Rick would introduce me as my father, Frank. He used to work with his hands. Like that was something shameful. Like the calluses on my palms were evidence of failure, instead of decades of building things that actually mattered. His friend Bradley, investment banker, naturally, asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Rick jumped in. "Dad's retired now. Used to be a machinist. Blue-collar stuff." The way he said blue-collar sounded like he was describing a disease. But here's what really got to me. Rick had taken down every photo of me from the house. The family portraits, my union recognition awards, even the picture of me and his mother at my retirement party. Replaced them all with his Harvard Business School diploma. Had it custom framed for $400. Put it right where our wedding photo used to hang. When I asked him about it, he said, "Dad, I'm trying to build a professional image here. These people I'm networking with, they have expectations." Expectations. Right. The phone calls were the worst part. Rick thought I couldn't hear him, but our house has thin walls. He'd be on the phone with his girlfriend, talking about his 5-year plan. Phase 1 was getting his inheritance. Phase 2 was dealing with the Frank situation. That's what I'd become to my own son. "I need him out," he told her one night. "The house needs updating anyway. Can't have clients coming over and seeing this." This, meaning me. Meaning the man who'd raised him, fed him, paid for his education, worked double shifts to make sure he never wanted for anything. He'd already contacted a real estate agent, had her come by to assess the property value. $485,000, she said. Prime location, good bones, needed some modernization. Rick walked her through every room like he already owned it, which, according to Will, number one, he did. That night, I found him in the garage, going through my tools. My Bridgeport milling machine that cost me $12,000 back in '98. My precision measuring equipment. 40 years of accumulated knowledge hanging on pegboards and stored in labeled drawers. "What's all this junk worth?" he asked, not looking up from his phone where he was researching eBay prices. Junk. 40 years of craftsmanship. Tools that had helped me solve problems Harvard never taught courses on. Equipment that had earned every dollar that built the life he was now inheriting. But I just smiled, said, "More than you know, buddy." That confused him. Rick was expecting anger, maybe tears. He wasn't expecting calm. He definitely wasn't expecting me to start making phone calls of my own. Late at night, after he'd gone to bed, I'd sit in my workshop and make those calls. Quiet conversations with people Rick had never met. People who knew exactly what my junk was really worth. People who were about to remind my Harvard MBA son that some education can't be bought. You have to understand what I was facing. If I stayed silent, if I just accepted Rick's version of reality, I'd lose everything that mattered. First, there was the house. Not just any house, the house where his mother and I had built our life together, where we'd brought Rick home from the hospital, where we'd celebrated his graduation from high school, college, and yes, even Harvard. Every room held 34 years of memories that Rick was planning to erase with his modernization. The real estate agent had been very thorough. Prime location, she said. Walk score of 89. Close to the university district where Rick's friends lived. With the right updates, new kitchen, open floor plan, contemporary finishes, the house could easily fetch $650,000. Maybe more. Rick had already picked out the contractor. Some outfit called Elite Home Transformations that specialized in what they called heritage property upgrades. And their portfolio was full of old houses that had been gutted and rebuilt to look like something from a design magazine. All character removed, all history erased. He'd shown me the plans on his laptop. My workshop would become a home office. The kitchen where his mother had made Sunday dinners would be torn down to create an open-concept entertainment space. The living room where we'd watched him play Little League would be expanded into something he called a conversation pit. But losing the house was just the beginning. See, Rick had convinced himself that his inheritance made him the family success story, the one who'd made it out. In his mind, I was just the blue-collar father who'd served his purpose and could now be discarded. He'd already started telling people that story. I found out because Mike Anderson, my old union rep and one of my closest friends, came by to warn me. He'd run into Rick at a coffee shop downtown. Rick was with some of his Harvard classmates, talking loud enough for half the place to hear. My dad's generation just doesn't understand modern wealth management, Rick had said. Guy spent 40 years in a factory and thinks that makes him wise. I'm trying to transition the family into the 21st century, but he's stuck in this blue-collar mindset. Blue-collar mindset. Like that was something to be ashamed of. Mike said one of Rick's friends had asked about my background. Rick's response was even worse. Honestly, I'm not sure what he actually accomplished. Worked with his hands, made an okay living, but never really built anything significant. That's why I went to Harvard, to break that cycle. Never built anything significant. That's when I realized the stakes weren't just financial. Rick wasn't just stealing my house, he was stealing my legacy. In his version of our family story, I was the limitation he'd overcome. The blue-collar ceiling he'd broken through, the embarrassment he'd left behind. And it was working. His girlfriend, Emma, had already started referring to me as Rick's project. As in, how's your project going? When she asked about moving me out. I wasn't Frank Miller, the man who'd raised her boyfriend. I was a problem to be solved. The worst part was watching how it affected the few family relationships I had left. Rick's cousin Sarah, my brother's daughter, had always looked up to me. I'd been the one who taught her to change her car's oil, who'd helped her fix her first apartment when the landlord wouldn't. But after a few dinners with Rick and his new crowd, she started looking at me differently. Uncle Frank, she'd said on our last phone call, maybe Rick has a point about updating things. You've worked so hard for so long, maybe it's time to let the next generation take over. The next generation. Like I was some relic from a bygone era, instead of a man with 34 years of knowledge that Rick couldn't Google. But here's what really kept me up at night. Rick was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and his arrogance was preventing him from seeing it. He thought that $55 million made him untouchable, thought his Harvard MBA made him smarter than everyone who came before him. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last 30 years building something that made his inheritance look like pocket change. Something he was about to lose because he'd never learned the most important lesson of all. Always check your facts before you burn your bridges. Because in exactly 72 hours, Rick was going to throw a party to celebrate his new life. And every single person in that room was going to learn what Frank Miller had really been building all these years. The dinner party was Rick's idea. A networking event, he called it. Translation, a chance to show off his inheritance and introduce his new social circle to the upgraded family situation. He'd invited 12 people, all Harvard MBAs, investment bankers, or consulting partners, the kind of people who wore their credentials like armor and measured success and portfolio values. Rick had spent $2,000 catering the event, hired some upscale outfit called Metropolitan Dining Solutions. Their servers wore black ties and spoke in hushed, professional tones. The whole thing felt like a wake for the family I used to know. I wasn't supposed to be there. Rick had made that clear. Dad, this is really a professional thing. Maybe you could find somewhere else to be tonight. But it was still my house, at least until the paperwork went through, so I stayed. Rick introduced me to his guests like I was part of the decor. This is my father, Frank. He's transitioning into retirement. Transitioning into retirement, like I was some kind of corporate restructuring project. The conversations were exactly what you'd expect. Talk about market volatility, merger opportunities, portfolio diversification. The kind of abstract financial discussions that happen when people who've never built anything try to sound important. That's when Rick made his first mistake. One of his guests, a partner at some consulting firm called Strategic Solutions Group, started talking about aerospace investments. The defense sector's been volatile, he said, but there's real opportunity in aerospace innovation, particularly in component manufacturing. Rick jumped in immediately. Absolutely. The key is identifying undervalued patents in the space. Most of the innovations coming from smaller players who don't understand their own intellectual property value. I almost choked on my coffee. The consultant nodded approvingly. Exactly. We've been advising clients to acquire patent portfolios in areas like bearing systems, turbine efficiency, propulsion components. The original inventors usually have no idea what their work is worth. Total blue-collar mindset, Rick added. These guys invent something useful, file the paperwork, then just leave money on the table. They don't understand licensing, royalty structures, strategic partnerships. Blue-collar mindset. There it was again. I set down my coffee cup. Rick, could you remind me which aerospace companies your firm consults for? The question caught him off guard. Several major players, Dad. Why? Just curious about your expertise in the field. Rick's chest puffed up. Well, I've been researching the sector extensively. Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, the entire supply chain. Boeing. I nodded slowly. Interesting company. Massive revenue potential, the consultant agreed, though they source components from hundreds of smaller manufacturers, patent holders who probably don't even realize what their innovations are worth. Absolutely, Rick said. Take something like bearing systems. Simple mechanical improvements that could be worth millions in licensing fees. But the original inventors, usually factory workers, technicians, they just don't have the business sophistication to monetize their ideas. Factory workers, technicians. The room was listening now. Rick was in his element, playing the role of the sophisticated business analyst, explaining complex market dynamics to his impressive social circle. The real opportunity, he continued, is in acquiring these undervalued patent portfolios and properly structuring the licensing agreements. Most of these blue-collar inventors would probably sell their rights for a fraction of their actual value. Blue-collar inventors. I stood up, walked over to the kitchen counter where I'd left my phone. Rick was still talking, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about the locked filing cabinet in my workshop, about the folders full of documentation that Rick had never bothered to examine. Dad? Rick's voice had an edge to it. Everything okay? I turned back to face the room. 12 Harvard MBAs and consulting partners, all looking at me with the kind of polite attention you give to someone's elderly relative at a social gathering. Just thinking about what you said, Rick, about blue-collar inventors not understanding their intellectual property value. Right. Rick relaxed. It's actually a perfect example of why education matters. Business education specifically. Absolutely, his girlfriend Emma chimed in. Rick's always talking about how his generation needs to think more strategically than their parents' generation. Their parents' generation. Tell me something, Rick, I said, my voice staying perfectly calm. In all your research on aerospace patents, did you ever look into the inventor behind bearing system patent number 5,923,891? The room went quiet. Rick's face showed the first flicker of uncertainty I'd seen all evening. That's pretty specific, Dad. How about patent 6,045,723? Turbine efficiency enhancement device? More silence. The consultant was now looking between Rick and me with obvious confusion. Dad, I don't have those numbers memorized. Of course not. I picked up my phone. But I do. Interesting thing about patent 5,923,891. Filed in 1996. Inventor listed as Frank Miller. That's me. Rick, you could have heard a pin drop. Rick's mouth opened, then closed. His girlfriend's wineglass stopped halfway to her lips. The consultant was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was actually Atman. Patent 6,045,723, I continued. Also, Frank Miller. Filed in 1998. Both patents are currently generating about $1.2 million annually in licensing fees. I looked directly at Rick. From Boeing. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Rick was frantically trying to process what I'd just said, but his Harvard-trained brain couldn't quite make the connections. That's not possible, he finally managed. I smiled. Rick, remember when you asked what all that junk in my workshop was worth? His face went pale. More than you know, buddy. The dinner party ended early. Rick's guests left in a flurry of awkward goodbyes and confused whispers. I watched them through the living room window, clustering in small groups on the sidewalk, their phones already out, probably Googling patent numbers and trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Rick stood in the kitchen, staring at the catering leftovers like they might provide some explanation for what had just happened. Emma was scrolling through her phone with increasing intensity, her perfectly composed social media facade cracking with each search result. "Dad," Rick finally said, "we need to talk." "Sure thing, buddy. What's on your mind?" The calm tone in my voice seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. He was expecting a confrontation, a dramatic reveal, something his MBA training had prepared him to handle. Instead, he got a conversation. "Those patent numbers, are they real?" "Very real. And they're yours?" Frank Miller is listed as the sole inventor on both applications, filed through Boeing's Internal Innovation Program between 1996 and 1998. Emma looked up from her phone. "Rick, I'm finding multiple references to these patents. Your dad's name is all over the aerospace industry databases." Rick slumped into one of the kitchen chairs. "But you never mentioned, you never asked." That was the truth. In all Rick's planning, all his networking conversations about aerospace investments and patent portfolios, he'd never once thought to ask his blue-collar father what exactly he'd been doing for 34 years at Boeing. "How much?" Rick's voice was barely a whisper. "How much what?" "How much are they worth?" I walked over to the coffee maker, poured myself a fresh cup. The kitchen felt different now, smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in on Rick's certainty about how the world worked. "That's an interesting question, Rick. Depends on how you calculate value." Emma was reading something on her phone, her eyes getting wider with each paragraph. "Rick," she said slowly, "I think you need to see this." She turned her screen toward us. It was a Boeing press release from 2019 celebrating the company's Innovation Hall of Fame. There was a photo of 12 employees being recognized for transformational contributions to aerospace technology. Third from the left, wearing a basic blue button-down shirt and looking slightly uncomfortable in the spotlight, was me. The caption read, "Frank Miller, recognized for bearing system innovations that have improved fuel efficiency across Boeing's commercial aircraft fleet." Rick stared at the photo for a long time. "This is from 2019. "Yep." "You were still working then?" "Yep." "But you told me you were just finishing up your time." "I told you I was ready to retire." "Didn't mean the work wasn't important." Emma scrolled down to read more. "It says here that Miller's innovations have saved Boeing an estimated $200 million in fuel costs over 20 years. Rick's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, realization, something that might have been panic. "Dad, how long have you known about my inheritance plans?" "Since you started making phone calls about real estate agents." "And you just let you what?" "Make assumptions? That's on you, buddy." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. I could practically see the wheels turning in Rick's head, trying to recalculate everything he thought he knew about our family's financial situation. "Dad," he said finally, "I think I may have made a mistake." "May have?" Emma was still reading, her finger scrolling through search results with increasing desperation. "Rick, there's a whole Wikipedia page about aerospace patents. Your dad's work is referenced in like 20 different articles." Rick rubbed his forehead. "Why didn't you tell me?" "When would have been a good time? Between you calling my work junk and planning to turn my workshop into a home office." He winced. "I didn't know. No, Rick. You didn't ask. Outside, I could hear a car pulling into the driveway. Then another. Rick looked toward the window with something approaching dread. Expecting someone? I asked. No, but... He paused, checked his phone. Oh no. What? Tomorrow's the Strategic Solutions Group quarterly meeting. I may have mentioned to some people that I had connection in the aerospace patent space. I smiled. Connections. Right. This was about to get very interesting. The Strategic Solutions Group quarterly meeting was held at the Marriott downtown. Top floor, corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The kind of venue designed to make everyone feel important. Rick had insisted I come, not because he wanted me there, but because he was starting to realize he might need me there. His confidence from the dinner party had evaporated completely, replaced by a desperate kind of energy that reminded me of his high school years when he'd oversold his knowledge on a test he hadn't studied for. The meeting started at 2 p.m. By 1:45, Rick was sweating through his $300 dress shirt. Dad, he whispered as we walked into the hotel lobby, maybe you could just keep things simple? Don't mention specific numbers unless someone asks directly? Sure thing, buddy. But Rick's problem wasn't what I might say. His problem was what he'd already said. The conference room held about 30 people. Senior partners, consulting directors, a few clients from major corporations. The kind of room where careers got made or destroyed based on the credibility of your presentations. Rick was scheduled to give a 15-minute overview of emerging opportunities in aerospace patent acquisition. According to the agenda, he was going to discuss undervalued intellectual property assets in the component manufacturing sector and strategic approaches to working with blue-collar inventors. Blue-collar inventors. He'd actually put that phrase in writing. The presentation started well enough. Rick had prepared professional slides, industry statistics, market analysis charts. He looked confident, sounded informed, hit all the right buzzwords about strategic positioning and market inefficiencies. Then came the questions. Rick, said a senior partner named Margaret Wheeler, you mentioned working directly with patent holders. Do you have specific examples of successful negotiations? Rick's PowerPoint slide showed a generic chart about value optimization. He clicked to the next slide. Absolutely. In fact, I have direct family connections to this space that provide unique insight into the inventor mindset. Family connections. My chest tightened. Could you elaborate? Asked a client from Raytheon. Well, Rick said, glancing at me in the back of the room, my father has worked in aerospace manufacturing for over 30 years. He provides valuable perspective on how blue-collar innovators approach intellectual property. Blue-collar innovators. There it was again. Margaret leaned forward. What kind of manufacturing? Component development. Bearing systems primarily. At Boeing, interesting. Boeing's bearing technology has been industry-leading for decades. Very sophisticated engineering. Rick nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Though many of the original inventors don't fully understand the commercial applications of their work. A man in a Navy suit raised his hand. Rick, when you say family connections, are you talking about general industry insight or specific patent knowledge? This was the moment. Rick could have backed down, explained that his father was just one factory worker among thousands, kept things general and safe. Instead, his Harvard MBA ego took over. Specific patent knowledge, Rick said confidently. My father's work has resulted in several key innovations that are currently generating significant licensing revenue. The room got very quiet. Margaret was taking notes. The Raytheon client had opened his laptop and was typing. Could you be more specific about the innovations? Margaret asked. Rick looked back at me again. I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was committed now, in front of 30 senior executives, and his only choice was to double down or admit he'd been bluffing. Bearing system optimization, he said. Turbine efficiency improvements. Technologies that have saved Boeing millions in operational costs. That's quite impressive, said the Navy suit man. Mind if I ask your father's name? I might know his work, and there it was. The moment Rick realized he'd painted himself into a corner with no way out. Frank Miller, Rick said, his voice barely audible. The Navy suit man's eyebrows shot up. Frank Miller? From Boeing's Innovation Hall of Fame? The room erupted in murmurs. People were pulling out phones, typing frantically. Margaret Wheeler was staring at me with undisguised interest. "Mr. Miller," she called out, "would you mind joining us up here?" I walked to the front of the room slowly, taking my time. Rick's face had gone completely pale. His PowerPoint presentation about working with blue-collar inventors was still projected on the wall behind him. "Mr. Miller," Margaret continued, "I have to say, we've been following your work for years. Patent 5,923,891 revolutionized bearing efficiency across the industry." "Thank you," I said simply. "And patent 6,045,723, the turbine enhancement system, that's generated what? Over $30 million in licensing revenue?" "Closer to $40 million, I corrected. "But who's counting?" The room went dead silent. Rick was staring at me like I'd just announced I was from Mars. Margaret looked back and forth between Rick and me. "Rick, when you talked about working with blue-collar inventors who don't understand their intellectual property value, were you referring to your father?" Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Because," Margaret continued, "Frank Miller is one of the most successful patent holders in the aerospace industry. His licensing agreements are considered the gold standard for inventor compensation." A woman from Lockheed raised her hand. "Mr. Miller, we've actually been trying to reach you for months about a potential consulting arrangement. Your work on efficiency optimization could save us millions." Another voice from the back. "Sir, our firm would be very interested in discussing representation for your next round of patent applications." I held up my hand. "I appreciate the interest, but I'm pretty much retired these days." Rick found his voice finally. "Dad, why didn't you tell me any of this?" The entire room turned to look at him. 30 senior executives, waiting for me to explain why my own son didn't know about my professional accomplishments. "Rick," I said gently, "you never asked. You were too busy explaining to everyone how blue-collar inventors don't understand intellectual property value." Margaret Wheeler was writing furiously in her notebook. The Raytheon client was openly staring. Someone in the back actually laughed. Rick's PowerPoint slide was still on the wall, the one about strategic approaches to working with blue-collar inventors. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Mr. Miller," Margaret said, "would you be willing to stay after the meeting? I think several of us would like to discuss some potential opportunities." "Of course." Rick slumped into his chair. His presentation was over, his credibility was destroyed, and everyone in the room now knew that the blue-collar inventor he'd been patronizing was worth more than everyone else in the building combined. But we weren't done yet, because as the meeting broke up and people started gathering around me with business cards and consulting offers, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Patricia Brown, Boeing's chief engineer. "Frank, saw the news about Rick's presentation online. Boeing team is at the Marriott for a conference. Mind if we stop by?" I looked at Rick, who was still sitting in his chair, staring at his failed PowerPoint presentation. "Rick," I said, "I think there are some people you should meet." Dr. Patricia Brown arrived 20 minutes later with 3 other Boeing executives. You could tell they were important people the moment they walked into the hotel lobby. The kind of confident authority that comes from running billion-dollar engineering projects. Rick was still in the conference room trying to explain to Margaret Wheeler how he'd mischaracterized his father's background. The conversation wasn't going well. Margaret had that look people get when they realize they're talking to someone who's fundamentally untrustworthy. "Frank," Dr. Brown called out as she approached our table. "Good to see you. We heard through the grapevine that you were here." Patricia was Boeing's chief engineer for commercial aircraft systems. I'd worked with her team for 15 years, though Rick had never bothered to learn the details of those collaborations. The 3 executives with her were equally impressive. James Carter, VP of Innovation, Lisa Rodriguez, Director of Patent Strategy, and Michael Davis, head of Boeing's Supplier Relations Program. Rick's eyes widened as he watched this parade of corporate heavyweights make their way over to shake my hand. Margaret Wheeler had stopped mid-sentence, clearly recognizing the Boeing team from industry conferences. "Patricia," I said, standing to greet them. "Good timing. I was just having a conversation with my son about intellectual property values." Rick's face went through several shades of red. "Ah, this is Rick," Patricia said, extending her hand. "Frank talks about you all the time. Harvard MBA, right? Impressive." Rick shook her hand weakly. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Frank, James Carter interjected, we actually came by to discuss something important. Legal just finished reviewing your patent portfolio for our upcoming congressional testimony on innovation policy. Congressional testimony? Rick's voice cracked slightly. House Subcommittee on Aviation, Lisa Rodriguez explained. We're presenting Frank's work as a case study in successful inventor-company partnerships. Margaret Wheeler had abandoned all pretense of her conversation with Rick and was now openly listening to our discussion. Michael Davis opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Frank, I know you're retired, but we wanted to show you the latest impact analysis on your innovations. He spread several documents across the table. The first was a Boeing internal report titled Miller Patent Portfolio, 25-Year Economic Impact Assessment. Rick leaned forward to read over my shoulder. I could hear his sharp intake of breath as he saw the numbers. Patent 5,923,891 alone has saved Boeing $47 million in fuel costs, Michael continued. Patent 6,045,723 has generated $41.2 million in direct licensing revenue. And your 2,018 turbine modification patent, 8,234,156, that's projected to save the industry $200 million over the next decade. Rick was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Frank, Patricia said, I have to ask, have you given any thought to our succession planning discussions? What succession planning? Rick asked before I could answer. Lisa Rodriguez smiled. Frank has been mentoring our next generation of engineers for the past 5 years, Boeing's Innovation Fellows program. We've been hoping he might consider a formal advisory role. Advisory role? Rick's voice was getting smaller with each revelation. The Boeing Innovation Council, James explained. It's our strategic advisory board for emerging technologies. Frank would be working directly with our C-suite on patent strategy and inventor development. Margaret Wheeler couldn't stay quiet any longer. Excuse me, she interrupted, but are you saying that Mr. Miller is being recruited for Boeing's executive advisory board? Not recruited, Patricia corrected. We've been asking him to join for 2 years. Frank keeps saying he wants to enjoy retirement. Michael Davis laughed. Though retirement for Frank apparently means consulting for Lockheed, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman on their patent acquisition strategies. Rick's head whipped around to stare at me. You're consulting for Boeing's competitors? Aerospace is a small industry, I said calmly. Everyone knows everyone. Frank's reputation precedes him, Lisa added. When the Pentagon wanted an independent assessment of next-generation aircraft efficiency technologies, Frank was their first call. Pentagon? Rick whispered. Margaret Wheeler was frantically taking notes. The other Strategic Solutions Group partners had gradually moved closer to our table, drawn by the realization that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Patricia noticed the growing crowd. Frank, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private. Actually, I said, looking directly at Rick, I think this is exactly where this conversation needs to happen. Rick's face had gone completely white. His Harvard MBA presentation about undervalued blue-collar inventors was still visible on the conference room screen behind us. Rick, I continued, remember yesterday when you told Emma that your father had never built anything significant? He didn't answer. Patricia, could you tell Rick about the economic impact of my patents? Dr. Brown pulled out her phone and opened what looked like a Boeing internal app. Combined economic impact across all Miller patents through 2023 TVET. $247 million in cost savings, $156 million in direct licensing revenue, estimated $400 million in future value over remaining patent life. The room was completely silent. And Rick, I said, remember when you told your consulting friends that blue-collar inventors don't understand the business sophistication required to monetize their ideas? Rick was staring at his shoes. Lisa, could you explain how patent licensing works? Lisa Rodriguez opened her briefcase and pulled out another folder. Frank maintains direct licensing agreements with 17 major aerospace companies. He negotiates his own rates, structures his own royalty schedules, and maintains approval rights over all applications of his technologies. Maintains approval rights? Margaret Wheeler asked. Frank owns his patents outright, James Carter explained. Boeing doesn't own them. We license them. Frank retains full control over how his innovations are used and by whom. Rick finally found his voice. But, but the inheritance. What inheritance? Michael Davis asked. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. Rick, this is will number 2, the real one. His hands were shaking as he took the paper. Will number 1 was a test, I continued. Your mother and I designed it to see what kind of man you'd become when you thought you had power over me. Rick unfolded the document. As he read, his face went through expressions I'd never seen before. According to will number 2, I explained to the room, Rick's inheritance is contingent on demonstrating respect for the people who built the foundation of his opportunities. He gets the house, the traditional inheritance, and access to my patent portfolio only if he can prove he understands the value of the work that came before him. Margaret Wheeler leaned forward. And if he can't prove that? Then everything goes to the Frank Miller Foundation for Blue Collar Innovation, a charity I established last year to provide patent education and legal support to working-class inventors. Rick was still reading, his lips moving silently as he processed the legal language. There's an evaluation period, I continued. 6 months for Rick to demonstrate that he's learned to respect the knowledge and contributions of people whose education came from experience rather than classrooms. And who evaluates that? Patricia asked. A board of 3 people. You as Boeing's chief engineer, Mike Anderson representing organized labor, and Janet Wilson, our family attorney. Rick looked up from the will. Dad, The evaluation starts now, Rick. Today, in front of all these people who just heard you call your father an undervalued blue-collar inventor who doesn't understand intellectual property. The Boeing executives were looking at Rick with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Margaret Wheeler was writing so fast her pen was practically smoking. The first test, I continued, is simple. Can you acknowledge in front of these business professionals that your father's 34 years of work have value that can't be measured by a Harvard MBA? Rick stared at me for a long moment. The room held its breath. Finally, he spoke. Dad, I owe you an apology. It was a start. Rick's apology was just the beginning. Over the next hour, in front of 30 business executives and 4 Boeing senior leaders, my son had to confront every assumption he'd made about success, education, and the value of different kinds of knowledge. It wasn't pleasant to watch, but it was necessary. I need to understand something, Rick said, his voice barely steady. How long have you been planning this? The will? Since your mother's diagnosis 2 years ago, she was the one who insisted on the test. Rick's face crumpled slightly at the mention of his mother. Mom knew? She knew you were smart, ambitious, and completely unprepared for the real world. Harvard taught you to analyze businesses, but it never taught you to respect the people who build them. Patricia Brown had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Rick, can I ask you something? Yes, ma'am. In your presentation today, you talked about strategic approaches to working with blue-collar inventors. What did you mean by that? Rick glanced around the room. Every face was watching him, waiting for his answer. I meant... He stopped, took a breath, started again. I thought that people like my father didn't understand the business side of their innovations. I thought they needed people like me to help them maximize value. And now? Now I realize I don't know anything about the business side of innovation. I know how to read financial statements and build PowerPoint presentations. My father knows how to create value from nothing. It was the first honest thing Rick had said in weeks. Margaret Wheeler looked up from her notes. Rick, Strategic Solutions Group has been trying to break into the aerospace patent consulting market for 3 years. We've had minimal success because we lack credible relationships with actual inventors. Rick nodded slowly, beginning to understand where this was heading. Your father, on the other hand, has relationships with every major patent holder in the industry. He's respected by Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, and the Pentagon. He's exactly the kind of strategic partner we need. Yes, ma'am. So here's my question. Instead of trying to manage your father's intellectual property, why don't you try learning from it? Rick looked at me. Dad, would you be willing to teach me? That was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of my success, but a recognition that he had something to learn. Rick, I've been trying to teach you for 30 years. The question is whether you're finally ready to listen. Dr. Brown stood up and began packing her documents. Frank, we should let you handle this family conversation. But before we go, Rick, Your father is one of the most respected innovators in the aerospace industry. If you're serious about learning from him, we'd be happy to provide some context about how the industry actually works. I would appreciate that very much, Rick said. After the Boeing team left, the Strategic Solutions Group meeting dissolved into smaller conversations. Several partners approached me about potential consulting arrangements. Others pulled Rick aside to discuss how his family connections might benefit the firm, though now they understood that the value flowed from me to Rick, not the other way around. Margaret Wheeler was the last to leave. "Frank," she said, "we'd be very interested in discussing a formal relationship with your foundation. Strategic Solutions Group would like to provide pro bono business consulting to working-class inventors." "That's generous, Margaret. I'll have my attorney send you the details." After everyone had gone, Rick and I sat alone in the empty conference room. His failed PowerPoint presentation was still projected on the wall, slides about undervalued blue-collar inventors that now seemed like artifacts from another era. "Dad," Rick said finally, "I've been an idiot." "Yes, you have." "I mean a complete, total, Harvard-educated idiot." "Harvard didn't make you an idiot, Rick. It just gave you a vocabulary for expressing your ignorance more effectively." He laughed despite himself. "So what happens now?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out another folder. "Now you start learning. This contains your reading assignments for the next 6 months: patent law, engineering principles, manufacturing processes, and labor history." Rick opened the folder. It was thick. "Your evaluation board meets in December. Patricia will test your understanding of how innovation actually works. Mike Anderson will assess whether you've learned to respect working-class knowledge. Janet Wilson will determine if you're ready to inherit the responsibility that comes with wealth. And if I fail, then you'll have learned something valuable about humility, and 40,000 working-class inventors will benefit from a very well-funded foundation." Rick nodded slowly. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., my workshop." "Your workshop? That's where the real education happens, buddy. Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty." The news traveled fast. By the next morning, Rick's presentation had become industry legend, not for the reasons he'd hoped. Margaret Wheeler, to her credit, handled the situation professionally. Strategic Solutions Group issued a quiet internal memo about ensuring accuracy in client presentations, and Rick was reassigned to projects that didn't involve aerospace consulting. His Harvard MBA credentials were still valuable, just not in the way he'd originally imagined. The real consequences started showing up in Rick's social media. His LinkedIn profile, which had previously featured updates about disrupting traditional industries and leveraging family connections, went silent. His networking posts about strategic opportunities in aerospace patents were quietly deleted. The professional photograph of him at his Harvard graduation was replaced with something more subdued. Emma, his girlfriend, took the news harder than Rick did. She'd built her own social media presence around being the partner of a young aerospace entrepreneur. Her Instagram was full of photos from industry events, networking dinners, and what she called power couple moments. All of that content suddenly looked foolish in light of Rick's public humiliation. "I don't understand," she told Rick during what would be their final conversation. "You said your father was just a factory worker." "He was a factory worker," Rick replied. "He was also one of the most successful inventors in the aerospace industry. I just never bothered to learn the difference." Emma moved out the following week. The professional consequences were more complex. Strategic Solutions Group didn't fire Rick. His Harvard credentials still had value, and his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes had actually impressed some of the senior partners. But his trajectory within the firm changed dramatically. Instead of being fast-tracked toward partnership, Rick found himself assigned to research projects, due diligence work, background investigations into patent portfolios and inventor credentials, the kind of detailed, unglamorous work that required him to actually understand the technologies he was analyzing. "It's probably for the best," Margaret Wheeler told him during his performance review. "You have good analytical skills, Rick. You just need to learn how to apply them to things you don't already think you understand." The Boeing executives, meanwhile, became regular visitors to our house. Dr. Patricia Brown started stopping by every few weeks, ostensibly to discuss technical questions with me, but really to observe Rick's progress. She'd ask him detailed questions about manufacturing processes, patent law, and engineering principles. Rick's answers went from embarrassingly ignorant to surprisingly informed over the course of 3 months. "He's learning," she reported to Janet Wilson, our family attorney. "Slowly, but genuinely." Mike Anderson, my old union rep, was tougher to convince. "Frank," he said after Rick's first month of 6 a.m. workshop sessions, "the boy's got soft hands and a softer brain. You sure about this rehabilitation project?" But Mike started to come around when Rick began asking questions about labor history, manufacturing economics, and the relationship between worker innovation and corporate profits. Questions that showed he was finally thinking about issues bigger than his own career advancement. "Maybe there's hope for him," Mike admitted. "Kid's got a long way to go, but at least he's walking in the right direction." The most significant change was in Rick himself. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity. He started reading trade publications, technical journals, and patent filings, not because he had to, but because he was finally beginning to understand how much he didn't know. "Dad," he said one morning while we were working on a bearing assembly in my workshop, "how did you know which problems were worth solving?" It was the first question he'd asked that demonstrated real insight. "Experience," I told him. 34 years of watching machines break down and figuring out why. You can't learn that from a textbook, Rick. You have to live it." His hands were getting rougher from the workshop sessions. His dress shirts were stained with machine oil. His Harvard MBA social circle had largely abandoned him, but he was building relationships with people who actually understood how things worked. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said after his 3rd month of evaluation. "Get what?" "Why Mom designed this test. I thought success meant rising above where I came from, but it really means understanding what I'm built on." The evaluation board would meet in December to determine Rick's future, but watching him work in my shop, asking real questions, and learning to value knowledge that couldn't be Googled, I was starting to think he might actually pass. Not because he'd earned his inheritance, but because he'd finally started earning his education. The kind of education that can't be bought with tuition payments or measured with grade point averages. The kind that can only be learned with your hands. December came faster than expected. The evaluation board met on a Tuesday afternoon. Janet Wilson, our family attorney, had booked the conference room at her law firm. Patricia Brown flew in from Seattle. Mike Anderson took time off from the Union Hall. Rick arrived 30 minutes early, wearing work clothes instead of a suit. His hands showed 6 months of shop work, calloused palms, permanently stained fingertips, the kind of rough skin that comes from building things instead of just talking about them. The evaluation lasted 3 hours. Patricia tested his understanding of engineering principles and patent law. Rick answered with the kind of practical knowledge that can only come from hands-on experience. He didn't just know how patents worked. He understood why they mattered to the people who created them. Mike Anderson asked harder questions about labor history and worker dignity. Rick's answers showed he'd learned to see factory work as skilled craftsmanship instead of manual labor. He talked about innovation coming from the factory floor, about the intelligence required to solve real-world problems under pressure. Janet Wilson focused on character development. Had Rick learned to respect knowledge that came from experience rather than education? Could he work alongside people who hadn't gone to Harvard? Did he understand that wealth carries responsibility to the community that created it? Rick passed unanimously. That evening, we sat in my workshop reviewing the evaluation results. Rick would inherit the house, receive access to my patent portfolio, and join the board of the Frank Miller Foundation for Blue-Collar Innovation. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I don't want the money." I looked up from the bearing assembly I was cleaning. "Excuse me? I want to earn my own patents first. Learn to create value before I inherit it. Would you be willing to keep mentoring me?" It was the best possible answer to a question I'd never thought to ask. "Rick," I said, "I'd be honored." 6 months later, Rick filed his first patent application. A small improvement to hydraulic systems, developed during our workshop sessions. Nothing revolutionary, but it was his. The foundation now provides education and legal support to over 200 working-class inventors across the country. Rick runs the day-to-day operations while I focus on technical mentoring. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way, but once learned, they tend to stick. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know what you think. Have you ever had to teach someone that wisdom doesn't always come with a diploma? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, some education can't be bought. It has to be earned.